Hi, I'm Martin Cohn. I work for the Toronto Star, and I'm not sure why I agreed to do this. It is great to be beside these folks, but when I agreed to this about a month and a half ago, I didn't realize that there would be a federal election going on, which tells you something about my own thought processes, which these people already know, which is that I'm always wrong. I didn't see this coming. I would never have agreed to it. It's a really hard act to follow federal politics at any time, and especially when there's a federal election on, and especially when we've just had a panel on before us. So we're here from Ontario. All right. I still feel like this is mission impossible, but thank you for that welcome. It actually isn't that hard to prove to you that Ontario politics matters at least as much as federal politics to people in this province. I think the real mission impossible is the challenge that you face in trying to get young people not just interested but motivated enough to vote. I am, however, going to do a survey at the end. If there's anybody, I think this panel is powerful enough to make the case that I've just made to you, that provincial politics matters more. If anyone doesn't agree at the end, we'll have a show of hands, and we'll have Mounties come out from Stephen Harper's protective detail and walk you out of the building and eject you from the premises. So
is that a partisan comment?
It is not, because you are part.
Don't walk them out. Kill them.
Well, even worse than that, they will be unfriended from their Facebook sites. But no, John Tory is from the, as I keep reminding people, from the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, as opposed to the Federal Conservative Party.
Progressive.
Yes. So, look, I will just briefly try to set the table, and then I will try to shut up and just ask my usual softball questions of these folks, and then turn it over to you for the tougher questions, because you're teachers. The one thing I would say, really, seriously, to set the table, is that I've always believed that, and I've covered federal politics and Ontario politics in a previous life, and back in the 1980s, when I was younger than he looks now. And the truth is that Queen's Park is in charge of the things that matters more to Mr. and Mississauga. And I think that's a message you can take to your students. I mean, you think about nuclear energy, for example, nuclear power in the news now. You think about healthcare and hospitals and education. And you think in terms of students, in terms of liquor laws, beer in corner stores, which I remember from way back in the 1980s. You think about driver's licenses,
important
roads.
To you, isn't it?
Pardon me?
Having accessible liquor is important to you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to be hard for me today, I can tell. So, look, it's the second biggest government in Canada. It's got a budget of $125 billion and a debt about twice that. It is a government that is accountable to 40% of the population of Canada. It's the second biggest government. So, Ottawa gets all the attention, but the action, trust me, really is at Queen's Park. The mystery is, and something I hope to talk about today with this expert panel, is why are people so oblivious to what happens at Queen's Park? Look, I'd like to hear what they have to say. I also want to hear what your secrets are as to how to get young people interested, because if I can figure that out, it might help save the newspaper industry, and I'd like to learn whatever I can about getting young people interested and engaged. I just want to say briefly that this is a personal passion for me, getting out the vote. I was overseas for about 10 years for the Star as a foreign correspondent, and I was based in the Middle East and in Asia, and these countries are in the news, as you know, in Egypt, in Algeria, in Tunisia, Yemen, Bahrain, Iran, Iraq. These are places where people are dying, literally dying, to cast a vote. And so when I come back here, and as Robin was saying quite eloquently a few moments ago, and you see participation rates in the 50s provincially, even lower municipally, it makes me want to cry. But I think just wringing my hands and wagging a finger, you know well enough, doesn't work with students. So you can't lecture and hector people about finishing their food because there are people hungry in China. You know, you can't try that argument. We need to get people motivated. So that's the challenge. That's why we have some big guns on our panel, to give you some ammunition. All of you know David Peterson as the 20th Premier of Ontario. I knew him before he was David Peterson and the 20th Premier of Ontario, and he was the leader of the opposition, head of the Liberal Party. He was an unknown. He was in the political wilderness. When he was in university, he was a boxer, and he fought his way to the top, and he toppled the Tory dynasty in 1985 with a little help from the NDP. And I'd like to find out how he did that, and how he connected with voters then, and what lessons we can learn today. Just briefly, because they all have formidable bios, he's earned his living as a lawyer. One of his great achievements was getting Mike Harris to work with him at his law firm. I don't know how he did that, but they are quite a formidable...
Tories, it's always money.
That's not true, because we'll come to John Tory in a moment. He has thrown himself into his work as Chancellor at U of T, so he's an educator now. And the man, amongst his other charities, has so many honorary doctorates, it's just not fair. And I think he should stop hoarding them and give out a few to some other people. He's also brought the pen and games to Toronto, for better or for worse. You all know John Tory as the former leader of the opposition in the legislature, head of the PC party, a man who had a very high profile, high name recognition, which is an important and impressive prerequisite, I think, to getting elected. I know him also from many years ago in a previous life when he was principal secretary or assistant secretary to Bill Davis, the brains behind the Davis government, and he was a young up-and-comer then. He went on to do a few other things, running a law firm, commissioner of the CFL, which is kind of cool. He was also, he ran your local cable company, but we won't go there. He has also done some great charitable work for St. Mike's Hospital and the United Way, and also for the film festival, TIFF, also kind of cool. You do a lot of interesting things. And he runs the something called Civic Action, which used to be the Toronto City Summit Alliance, and he very wisely changed that clunky name. It's a great outfit that brings a lot of the best and the brightest together to do a lot of brainstorming for the future of Toronto. He's always been a man in a hurry, and he has to rush out of this event today, as you know, because he's got to do his radio show, which is his real day job now. He hosts the News Talk 1010 drive home show. Now, we were thinking about the other logical person would be the former leader of the NDP, Bob Rae, but since he's no longer that, it would have been not a fair fight to have two Liberals against one Tory. So the obvious choice was Cheri DiNovo, who is made quite an impact already in the last few years. She arrived in the legislature, I believe, in 2006, and has made a name for herself on social justice issues, among other things, minimum wage, fighting against payday companies that charge extortionary interest rates, something that our newspaper also takes very seriously. And she, unlike these guys, had a life before politics. She entered politics, I'm sure, to save the world, but she actually was already saving the world as a United Church minister, and I think her claim to fame, among other things, is performing the first legalized gay marriage in North America. So that is your panel. The election is about almost 5 months away, and no one is really talking about it. There's a good excuse because there's a federal election going on. But even if there were not, I suspect it would not really be on people's radar screens yet. It's a fixed date, as you know, October the 6th. This government in Ontario actually respects fixed date elections, and that's a partisan shot at the last election.
Another one.
Yeah. Yep, big score. No one really knows who the progressive conservative leader is who took over from John. Does not yet have the same name recognition, hasn't fought an election yet. Tim Hudak. Very popular. He's way ahead in the polls, despite people not knowing that much about him. The third party leader is not that well known at all, and that's not unusual for third parties. When I ask New Democrats, friends of mine, who the party leader is, I find I usually draw a blank. And if I ask, is it a man or a woman, is it kind of a hint? Don't really get an answer. Some folks do kind of stop me. Don't tell me. Don't. I know Jack Layton. Right? Which is an understandable thing because he has high name recognition, but it's hard. And the answer, of course, is Andrea Horwath. So I want to ask David and John first. You have both been in the wilderness, and then you've been high profile. Why is it so hard David, why don't you start? Why is it so hard to get noticed in Ontario in opposition or sometimes even as Premier?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that, except nobody cares. But let me just recite my own experience. I became leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, leader of the Liberal Party, in 1982. And it wasn't a fair fight. I was fighting against Bill Davis, who John Tory was the principal secretary to. And these guys had been around for 42 years, or 39, I guess, at that point. And it's not like they were bad government. They're just kind of like an old shoe. You know, they were just kind of comfortable, and they were very shrewd. And Bill Davis actually was an excellent premier. I hate to admit this. I never would have admitted that in a campaign, but I admit it now. So anyway, I fought like a son of a gun. Nobody knew what was going on. And we took a poll about my name recognition, and I had virtually no name recognition. But then the problem was they asked what they thought of me, and the people that knew me didn't like me. So this is a heck of a dilemma. Do you get better known and more disliked, or do you just kind of hide and pretend it doesn't matter? The only time the game is even is during a campaign. And you go in with expectation, the press watches, your enemy watches, the other people watch. But at that point, you get an opportunity to speak in an unfiltered way to the population. When I went into my first campaign, I was 20 points behind, and any normal person would have despaired about that. It didn't bother me because things move very quickly during a campaign, and Bill Davis left, and Frank Miller came in and presented us opportunities, and in many ways, it's an advantage to have low expectations. So you come on the scene, people look at you and say, actually, this guy can walk and chew gum at the same time. We ran a very energetic and progressive campaign and kind of ended up more or less in a tie with the Conservatives at the end of that election. Now, but that wasn't really, why don't people care? Do you know, let me give you a broad answer to this, and we can maybe discuss this. I think the hardest thing in the information age is to convey information of any substance. There's so much competition. There's so many people competing for your headspace. And what we see, a dumbing down of everything. We see the preeminence of reality TV. People magazine started all this thing. It tends to be celebrity-based and very short-term. And I see, I'm not dismal about this, but I see less serious discussion of serious issues than I saw when I was in the business. And I don't know the answer to that. I think we're going to have to come back to you guys to sort of engage you in a discussion how to change that. But I don't like the quality of public debate right now. It's personal, it's vicious, it's not ladylike or gentlemanly. It is, and it's like bratty kids. You know, and we put up with bratty kids. But 20 years ago, a teacher could just throw them out of the room, or I guess I was going to say slap them, but I'm not going to say that. But you can't do that anymore. And we have such high standards of public accountability, everybody doing their own thing. So I think there's sociological answers for that, Martin, but
you
I
know,
don't know
one of the things, I've been back at Queen's Park for a few months now in this new role as columnist, and you often have students who come into the public gallery, as you know, led by their teachers, and you can just see the speaker feel the hair standing up on the back of his neck bristling, and they usually invoke students as the reason for the grown-ups to behave, but they usually don't. And it comes to mind because you talk about expelling people from the room, and the speaker is forever threatening to not slap them around, but to send them out of the room. John, what do you think?
Well, I think we're always, and David didn't do this, but we're always looking for people to blame in terms of why things are the way they are, because I completely endorsed your comments about the level to which the sort of discourse has sunk in terms of low. And the sort of style of politics today, and I think it contributes to why people apparently don't care. I think they do care deeply. I mean, if you look at the provincial level of politics versus, say, federal, you know, should we be caring more, and would in fact people care more, young and old, about all-day kindergarten as opposed to the purchase of, what is it, F-35 aircraft? Would they care more about the delivery of healthcare services versus the issue of a national securities regulator, which is not unimportant? Would they care more about the enforcement of family support orders for people who are struggling, as distinct from our free trade policy with Colombia, or, you know, whatever? These issues are the vital issues to families, you know, I think more so than at any other level of government. And I would place municipal sort of first or second with provincial, and I would actually place federal third. Now, that's just my own perspective. I think, though, when it comes to sort of why things are the way they are, we have ourselves to blame for that. We have reacted to this kind of dumbing down of the discourse by deciding not to vote because we're, I mean, not everybody, but certainly now it's approaching 50% of the population that don't bother because they think the process doesn't mean anything anymore, that they listen to politicians and platforms and then none of it's really followed through on, and so on and so forth. They watch the juvenile behavior level in the legislature, and people just say, I won't bother to vote. I mean, I don't mean this to sound either self-serving or for people to be feeling sorry for me. I really tried in a very deliberate and sort of outspoken way to say that I wasn't going to heckle, that I was going to conduct myself differently in the legislature as opposition leader, where David Peterson was one of the ones that told me when I ran for the job, maybe the worst job you ever have if you get it. Because it is. It's very difficult because, and this is another part of the problem, the premium that is placed by the media, and I don't want to sound like I'm blaming them either, because in the end I think we all deserve our share of the blame for all this, but the media take 5 seconds, if you're lucky, 7 seconds or 8 seconds, not every day, from the opposition leader who may well be asking perfectly valid questions that it is his or her responsibility to do, and that's what you get. So the temptation to talk in controversial, polarized, unduly colorful, exaggerated words is very high, including in the legislature. And that's what you get. You get this kind of thing that's more like a three-ring circus and more like entertainment, as I heard the previous panel discussing, than it is about substance. If you ask thoughtful questions that actually relate to the merits of all-day kindergarten, which I happen to think there are many, for example, or any of those kinds of things, it's lost. People will, that question's way too complicated to get on the 6 o'clock news. That then explains why your profile doesn't get up. So I think we deserve a lot of the blame, frankly, for putting up with this. And that only in some way, if we actually decide we're going to go out and vote, accompanied by a leader that actually has the courage to stand up and say, it's got to be different, I've got to be straight with you, I've got to tell you what some of the failings and shortcomings and challenges are of the healthcare system or the education system or the finances of the province. Until those two things come together, I don't think it's going to change.
Before I turn to Cheri, because I would like her perspective as well, just wanted to follow up on something you raised. You anticipated one of my thoughts. First of all, John is the first politician of our generation who I've ever heard say 5 to 7 second clip. Usually politicians say 30-second clips. They're so short.
Yeah, my problem was I gave 47-second clips,
well,
so
that's true.
It was a little higher than 7.
But usually people have this notion of 5 to 7 seconds is accurate, and people always have this exaggerated notion of 30 seconds. John, one of the raps against you, and don't worry, it's not going to be an uppercut.
No, it's the third part.
No, it's not. Just give me
right
the chance. I didn't cover John. I just arrived recently. He was gone. One of the raps against you is that you were too nice, that you tried too hard to play fair. Do you have any regrets about that?
Well, only insofar as that I never had the opportunity to be in government, and I think I could have done some good there, but that's a sort of a notion you have to have, or why would you bother to run? But otherwise, no, because I think what I've always said is you got to get up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror, and if there's such, I mean, I think David used the expression with me at the back of the room, too reasonable, even as a talk show host, that I'm too reasonable. You know what? I listened to the talk show hosts when they told me when I was going to become one. I'd never done it before, and I listened to the ones in the United States, and they said, go listen to this guy and go listen to that guy. They were lunatics. I had no intention of turning myself into one of those, either ideologically or in personality terms, because it's not me. And when they asked me in the beginning of the 2007 election, what kind of a person do you think you're going to be in the election? I said, well, actually, I'm going to try to be myself because it's a lot easier than trying to be someone else. You are what you are. Yeah. And in my case, it was more important to be able to get up and look in the mirror. And I feel badly because I know there were people who lost their seats, perhaps because I was too nice or too reasonable or whatever it is that people say. But that's just me, and I guess I didn't make it. And that's the way it goes. We move on.
I think people.
Let me now take Cheri's spot here, but I did mean to say, I think John Tory
Boys.
is the finest. I think he's the best mayor this city has never had, and he's the best premier this province has never had. He is the kind of person that should be in public life. In spite of the fact he's a Tory. I overlooked that. Everything else about him is perfect.
All right, Cheri, thank you for indulging us, and we were not going to forget you. Your leader is, I've heard in the legislature, her name again is Andrea Horwath, is quite a fine speaker. She's got a great stage voice, and she has that authenticity thing, but she's not registering, as far as I can tell, and that's to be expected in between campaigns. But do you have any thoughts on how that's going to play out, and what do you think? How does she get some attention before September, October?
Sure. Well, first, before I answer that question, it's one of the first instances I've had to be able to say thank you to the educators in the room, because my bill, the $10 minimum wage bill that is now $10.25 in law, is mainly there because of the STAR help, but also because of the work of your unions right across this province. So thank you. Because of you and because of that bill, 1 million Ontarians got a 28% raise. So thank you. I haven't had a chance to say that before. In terms of name recognition, let me say that we live way too close to the United States. I'll start with that. And we live way too close to a reality of a two-party system. And even in this federal election, there's this incredible strategic voting move where, and I'm going to sound like a United Church minister here and not like a politician, but I think you should do everything out of love and not fear. There's an incredible move in the media and everywhere else to get you to base your vote on fear, to vote against someone rather than for someone. And as long as we're in that mindset, we'll end up with a two-party system and we'll end up being the United States. And for teachers, that's not a good future. Let me remind you that it's the third party that gave us Medicare, that gave us pensions. And why? Because for some reason we get into the story. Now, why don't we get into the story now, and why isn't Andrea known? Well, part of it is, David mentioned this, you know, your name recognition comes in the heat of the battle of a campaign. There's no doubt about that. But the other thing is that she does get into the story, but it's in the fourth paragraph. You know, there's the picture of Dalton, and there's what Dalton did, and then there's second, the official opposition, comment, and then there's Andrea, the bottom of the story, and most people don't read that far. So in the heat of the battle, in the heat of the campaign, that's when you'll hear about Andrea. But the other issue too, and I think this is critical, is that we live in a first-past-the-post system. And as long as we don't recognize the value of every person's vote, we don't live in a true democracy. Most of the world lives with proportional representation of some sort or another in the advanced democracies, as I would call them. And that's where everybody's vote counts. So again, this plays into the two-party system. It plays into not having a third or fourth or fifth party, which is what they often have in Europe and often in more socially progressive countries from a social democrat's point of view. For example, like Scandinavia, where post-secondary education is free. We don't talk about those issues here because that voice is lost. So if every vote counted, which it would, with proportional representation, then certainly more voices would get into the story. The other aspect of it is, listen, we live in a patriarchy. Who doubts that? We have a female leader. Female leaders haven't fared too well in this country. I mean, they don't fare too well even running for election. We have one of the worst records for electing women. That's something I've tried to change in my own riding by starting Girls' Government. It's something that we should all be very focused on changing with our girl children. If you walk into Queen's Park, the first 2 floors, you will see nothing but the portraits of men, and there's lots of them. Why? Because there's never been a woman speaker, ever, in the history of Ontario. The only 2 women are Agnes MacPhail, it's a bust of her as you walk up the stairs, and I rub her shoulder for good luck before question period, and the Queen. That's it. So, you know, here, these are the cards stacked against both Andrea for being a woman and the third party for being a third party. But, you know, rest assured, I think that in this room, I can safely say we don't want to become Americans. So by all means, fight against, please, that incredible machine that's not only the media, it's everywhere, that tells you you only have 2 choices at the polls, because that just ain't so.
Thanks, Cheri. But let's not forget there was a ballot in the last provincial election which gave people a choice to have mixed member proportional, I guess, MMP.
Can I comment on that?
No. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. So people had a chance. I know it wasn't publicized correctly. It didn't get enough ink. It didn't get enough fair play. But people had a chance. Unfortunately, the voter turnout was so low to begin with that it didn't go very far, or in BC. But let's not get too sidetracked. But yeah, do you want to have a quick riposte on that?
Well, I was just going to say, Bart, that's why. I mean, it was, I would say, a very well-organized campaign against proportional
It
representation.
could have been that it was a dumb idea too, but we could argue that. We could argue that at a different occasion. I fundamentally disagree with your position on proportional representation, and I think, frankly, Cheri, a lot of other rational people do. But we can discuss that at a different point. That's an issue for the
I mean, the only thing I will say to that is that from a woman's point of view, if you look at countries that have proportional representation, you have a far, far higher and sometimes equal number of women in governments. Right off the bat, you also have a far higher proportion of people of color and of various minority groups. And also, you have every vote counting, which I think is critical.
May I make a short comment on this?
Yeah.
Only to say this. People can disagree, and I'm sure some will, including Cheri, but I believe it is far more important at this juncture in our democratic history, when we see declining participation in elections. It's more important to restore people's faith in leadership and in how politicians conduct themselves before you change the way that we vote. I think changing the way we vote is a legitimate subject for discussion as to some of the things you talked about, women and diverse people and so forth to be in the parliaments, but I think until politicians start to be honest again about the issues, start to talk about the issues as opposed to this kind of polarized posturing that goes on. I think that's the thing that should be remedied first, and it's actually easier to remedy because it's a matter of behavior and discipline to do that as opposed to, to changing the Constitution or changing the rules. So I just think it's more fundamental to get people's confidence back in the people who are there and how they act and how they lead or don't lead, more so than changing the system.
I'm going to bring the gavel down crashing on proportional representation because
Can I pick up on John's
sidetrack.
point about
Yes.
something else, Omar?
Yep.
I think he makes a profound point, and it is the only business in the world that I'm aware of where just because I'm on the opposite side, I can stand up and tell the world he's a crook, he's a bum, he's a thief, and it's so personal these days. So if any kid watches the professionals with this low level of attack, and a lot of it's done, I think John's right, to attract media. The more extreme, the more likely you are to get it today. If half the people are calling everybody else, these horrible things, why wouldn't an untutored or unschooled person watching this kind of believe that they're all like that? Now, on one hand, you can say that's democracy. We have been doing it for the last 400 years since in the British parliamentary system, and the House is the fulcrum of debate. On the other, and so you can say, well, you need honest debate. On the other hand, the standards have deteriorated so very, very much. As you know, at Queen's Park, or in the House of Westminster, the front benches are 2 swords' lengths apart from each other. And the reason they are, so people you could yell at them, you couldn't stab them. Now we have instantaneous transmission of everything. Television is ubiquitous, modern electronics are ubiquitous, and everything can be seen by everybody. And you see the most childish, scurrilous, vicious behavior. You wouldn't allow it with your kids. You can't do it in business. You couldn't attack the teacher in the next room the same way. You can't, and I have a theory for that too. You see, we're so politically correct in this world, you can't tell jokes about anybody else anymore. You can't hate anymore in public. The only place is legitimate to hate is on the basis of political beliefs. And that, it almost should be disallowed the way we disallow hatred on the basis of religion or color or sex or gender or anything else. I know I'm being a bit extreme here, but I say to you, if we allow hatred in our system, and it's probably the only outlet we have where you can get away with it, it is destructive across the board. That's just a personal theory.
When I first came back into Queen's Park beginning of this year, I was wondering why it had gotten so chippy. And there's so much heckling. I had to reach under the drawer in the press gallery overlooking the chamber to find the actual earpiece so that I could hear above the din, and nobody in the press gallery knew that these earpieces had ever existed. Just my ancient memory. And now I've found earpieces for all of my colleagues, and they all listen now with earpieces, so they can actually understand what's going on. It wasn't exactly clear to me why this was happening, though, because let's go back to the beginning of this conversation. People actually don't pay that much attention to provincial politics. And the truth is that question period does not get much ink, and it probably gets even less airtime these days. And yet, the dialogue has gotten, or the debate, the level of debate has sunk even lower, I think, in the last few years. So I'm not sure why they're doing that. And then I figured it out in talking to somebody who prepares question period. And it's really more of a team, like a hockey game of sorts. It's almost for internal consumption. And it's really to make the other guy look bad and just build up my guy. And it's largely, I think, I've inferred, for the consumption of the MPPs. It's more to rally the team, caucus unity, and fighting spirit for the campaign that approaches. But you may have a different take. Sure.
Yeah, actually it's driven by the press, and John could probably comment on this, but when we discuss in caucus, and I'm sure it's the same in every caucus, the discussion is not so much about how you got somebody, but what is the press interested in, what will the press cover? And I think that's unfortunate in part. But that is certainly an element, because you could ask the most philosophically deep question that the world has ever heard. But if the press doesn't cover it, it doesn't exist. And so there's always that idea. To give you an idea, though, of I think what David's saying and how bad it is, this last week, the major lead-off question from the official opposition was about prisoners having access to extended cable. That, I don't think, is the major concern of most Ontarians right now. I really don't. It became a gotcha back and forth discussion between, no, it was your government that started that first, no, it was your government, your expenses aren't shown, no, your expenses aren't shown. It was, from the third party's point of view, pretty bizarre, but it got coverage, and yet the question we asked, which I think, obviously, I'm partisan-based, was more important, which was our corporate tax giveaways, or lowering the corporate tax rate, is that a reasonable economic strategy? It's Dalton McGuinty's strategy. Is that, and that got very, very little coverage by comparison to the extended cable for prisoners. So you can see why political parties morph question period the way they do. In terms of the bad behavior, because I'm a deputy speaker as well, and so when I sit in the chair, I try to curtail it as well. But it's a funny exercise, and you should try it with your students. It's a good one. Get them to enact question period. And if you do, you will find that it's very difficult to control the outbursts if they're talking about something they feel passionate about. Because one thing you can do at Queen's Park in the legislative chamber, you can't do anywhere else, is lie, straight out lie. You can malign people's character. You can do things you would be sued for in a heartbeat outside of that chamber. You can get away with it inside. Now imagine if somebody said that to you, how you would feel. I mean, that gets your heart rate pumping, and it gets you angry. And kids, when they enact question period, inevitably we watch them when they come through on tours, and inevitably it provokes them too. Not justifying the bad behavior, always trying to curtail it, but there's an explanation.
Because we kind of excuse it. Chris Bentley, well, I moved a resolution one time to have a debate on this whole business of sort of civility inside the legislature, and Chris Bentley made one of the best speeches that I've ever heard. He's the Attorney General now. And he said, I grew up as a lawyer in a courtroom. And he said, when you go in a courtroom as a lawyer, you're as passionate, you're as determined to win, you are there to represent your client's interest and win the point, whatever it may be. He said, but you'd never think about getting up and maligning the judge or maligning the person on the other side, calling them names. You wouldn't be allowed to use language like that. He said, so why is it that in a place that's just as competitive, it's not two sword lengths apart, but it's just as competitive, and everybody's trying to win just as hard, you're not allowed to do that, and you discipline yourself not to, but when you go to the place that I think of as the highest calling of all, to the legislature to make laws, you can behave that way because we let people do it. And I just want to come back to the whole focus of why people are not paying attention to provincial politics. We're also letting people get away with asking questions on enhanced cable TV or whatever because it's actually easier for them than to discuss the real issues. The real issues, I mean, like, what is the sustainability of our healthcare system going forward, or we're spending more and more on post-secondary education, but have we really addressed the core issues there in terms of class sizes and all kinds of things that I don't think have been addressed, even though we're spending lots more money, and on you could go with the list. Those are actually very tough to deal with, and they're very electric to deal with, because they tend to produce emotional reactions from people and professionals and others. And so it's just easier to get up and ask about enhanced cable TV, knowing the media will dutifully write it up because everybody else can sort of understand, oh yeah, we cable packages and so on. And that's what gets asked about. It's ridiculous, really. I mean, in terms of the big issues we face out there that are not getting addressed by anybody, and we let them get away with not addressing them.
Obviously, I'm just going to try to change the subject here because it's a good subject, but I think I'm fearing it might hold the rest of our agenda hostage. And I want to move us off of question period because we could all keep going on this, and there's lots of good stories to tell. But I want to talk about our main theme, which you just raised again, which is trying to get people engaged. And you just touched on about substance. So let's segue into that. Let's talk about party platforms. And I'd like to hear, because we're here with educators, I'd like to hear from each of you about how they really play into the way people process politics, pay attention, and so on. Everybody pays lip service to substance over style. And everybody says, let's hear your policies. Let's not talk about these puerile name-calling things. Let's talk about the real issues that matter. Are people really willing to engage? You have all introduced significant policy packages or deliberated over them over your time. What kind of reception do you get? Let's blame the media a little bit, but the media are often hankering after policies as well. Then they get fixated on horse races. But is the public interested in policy, and what role do platforms play in the election and the pre-election period? Cheri, why don't you start?
Well, as you see in the federal election, which is before us, people are rolling out their platforms in the second, third week of the actual election itself, and usually precious few items in terms of the whole governance of a nation. There's a reason for that, and that is that it seems to work in our system, and that's the way the game is played. And if you do it too early, other parties will cherry pick what you did, or you'll get in trouble for it. Witness faith-based education. That will become the issue that you didn't want to have as the issue. So that's the reason, over sort of trial and error, that parties roll out their platforms, run on about 4 or 5 key issues, and roll them out at sort of given periods when they think they can get the most press and the most polling bang for the buck during the election itself. Now, that's the reality we live in. Is that the reality we want to live in? I personally love policy, and I think, like John, I would love to see more in-depth, and like David too, in-depth discussion about important issues. And I think, more to the point, we're talking about engagement in the political process. I mean, I think our young people look at this, especially, we've got the American example again. Why negative ads? They work. It's that simple. They work. They work. They have direct impact on the polls. So people do them if they want to win. It's all about winning. And I think that's a very poor political message to send out to young people. I think all parties are guilty of it. How do you turn it around? Do you turn it around by losing big time? Don't know. I mean, there have been some very, very dramatic examples of how not to do it. One of the ones I can think from my own party was, remember the corporate welfare bums? Boy, did that tank, right? Now, I mean, so obviously...
Faith-based schools wasn't a big winner either.
Faith-based schools wasn't a big winner either. So, I mean, so how do we turn that around? Well, I know for my kids who are young people, and I know for their friends, the issues that are really paramount to them are the issues they'd like to see discussed in depth. Unfortunately, they're not the ones going to the polls, and this is where I think you as educators come in. Do I think that we've lost kind of the bone that gives us democracy? No. I mean, look at the world. I mean, look at Egypt. Look at North Africa and the Middle East. Look at what a people can do with guns pointed at them. Never mind people that just have to get out of bed and go to the polls or get active around a political campaign. So, I mean, I like to do my bit, but I think when I talk to young people, I always say the same things to them. I say, none of us want a one-party state. We have various parties for a reason, because they represent different ideologies, and those are valuable ideologies. They represent points of view. But you as young people have to work within your tradition and reform it. because we've all been guilty of good things and not so good things in our history. And young people really get motivated by that. They get, that excites them. If you're a Liberal, reform the Liberal Party. If you're an NDPer, reform the NDP. If you're a Tory, reform the Tory Party. That gets them excited. I think just getting them to work on a campaign, knocking on doors and telemarketing basically for a summer around 5 issues that sounds somewhat like everybody else's issues, that doesn't do it for young people. So that would be my advice.
David?
What was the question?
Platforms.
I
Pros
think
and
platform, I think probably the most important thing in politics is leadership. Now, platform very much bears on the leadership issue and how they manage that platform. But in an age when you're under constant scrutiny and you see all these leaders, you see your politicians, and you can see if you don't like their smile or their teeth or their hair or and you form a personal relationship almost. And so most people can look at their political leaders and describe them in 2 or 3 or 4 adjectives: good, bad, stupid, good policy, bad policy. And that leadership will often trump an issue. Say, I disagree with the guy on this, or the person on this, but I like him or her. And that would be my experience. So, and you cannot escape that personal relationship with people. Now, and then you take the traditions out of this, of people historically one way or the other. It's not often that one policy will turn a debate, an election. You could argue this faith-based schools was a key issue. You could argue free trade was. But I don't see in this current federal election any major issue that is turning it one way or the other. And platform is important, and comfort with the platform is important. Let me make one other point. I looked at all these debates, and I'm obviously fascinated by it. I am amazed. You look at all 4 of those politicians, they repeat themselves till they make you sick. Really. It's a very cynical view of the world that they think you're so dumb, you, the people, the consumers, that they have to repeat their basic lines 20 times in the same debate. And people, and why do they do it? Well, you can say, well, they actually have a pretty low view of the electorate, that if you don't only say it once, they don't understand it. So they got to put it in very simple lines. These guys practice their lines, and this is across politics everywhere, and they say it 1,000 times, and finally then, do you understand? This is a real problem, as I see it, because politicians have a pretty low view of the electorate. And I know politicians that say, you got to tell a lie. If I say it enough, it'll become the truth. And so we have to, somehow or other, the politicians will respond to an electorate that demands more of them. Not sure. Maybe that's where you guys have a role.
I think that's a good point that David raises. This repetition messaging issue, people call it discipline. I've decided to just call it repetitiveness. I think it's a real danger for young people. I think it has the potential to really turn people off, and I think young people have a pretty good BS meter, as you probably all know, and when they see that, it just rings phony. John, thoughts on that?
Well, when you say it has the potential to turn people off, I think it's gone a lot further than that. I mean, it has turned people off. That's why they turn out. I remember the federal election, because I've been talking about it on the radio, is that it was 58% the last time. We're getting down towards half of the people who just don't vote because they don't think it's worthwhile, because they think they're sitting listening to these little contrived lines that people come up with. And one of the other reasons that I think people repeat those lines over again and over is not just because a pollster or somebody in a room told them they should, but it's also because, as I said earlier, it's actually easier than discussing the real issues. And it's actually less risky. I was talking on the CBC this morning about why the debate was the way it was. Well, because your greatest fear, unfortunately, and it's funny because in business you don't get pilloried the same way when you make a mistake in business or in law. And people make mistakes, of course, because they're human in business and law every day, but it's not published on the front of the paper making you look like an ass, 12 hours later. And so you're prepared to be a little bolder and take some risks and do some things that perhaps haven't been tried before. In politics, when you make a mistake in the government, you know, you're pilloried, and that's again a bit our fault that we sort of have got into that sort of culture that sort of says you can't be bold. So what's the result? Nobody is bold. Nobody will take on talking in an honest way about health care or about pensions or about a lot of things because there's really no reward in it. And again, it's a dangerous issue to raise anywhere. I've certainly learned that. But, you know, I really tried in a genuine way from my heart to raise, and in a logical and I thought sensible way, the issue of the faith-based school thing. And it was not because I thought it was a big winner. I mean, in fact, we'd done polling that showed that it wasn't a big winner. It was something that was sort of at best a wash, but it was an issue of principle that related to partially unfairness, but also this notion that I had, which maybe was something that I shouldn't have worried myself about, that there were more and more and more and more private schools founding themselves out there, whether we liked it or not, on a faith basis. And if you wanted to bring those people into the public education system, then that you had to do something to accomplish that. And so, but I mean, I tried to put it forward logically. It was about 3 paragraphs in a 50-page platform. And we had a lot of other, I thought, really good ideas about a whole bunch of things, the environment and families and, you know, whatever. And none of those ever got discussed, including by me, because I was never given a chance. And I'm not complaining about that. I'm just using that as a bit of a historical marker to say that my experience, and that one you might say was unwise politically to raise it at all, even in 3 paragraphs or logically or any other way. But to say, people will look at my experience and sort of say, well, if it's an issue like that, and healthcare, and even paying for transportation, do you use road tolls, parking charges, increased taxes, sales taxes, gas taxes? The bottom line is you got to use one of those medicines to pay for the transit we need. The notion that it's going to be free or that the money's going to fall out of the sky is not happening. But who is going to raise that, and who is? Do you hear anybody raising it now? No. But yet we go on not making the decision, not building as much transit as we should be because no one wants to raise the issue of how to pay for it because you get your head shot off. And who does the shooting? I mean, it's the electorate that does that. So that's why I started off saying today we blame the media, we blame politicians. The public deserves a bit of blame because in some respects, you know, to use that old line from Jack Nicholson in that movie Down in Cuba there, you know, you can't handle the truth. Well, the public can handle the truth, but they choose not to. It's easier to not really worry about how to pay for transportation. It's easier not to worry about what's going on in the school system because it's just easier. And then these things fester and they don't get resolved and nobody addresses them.
You've seen John in action now. He has a weird habit of telling the truth, to say that people don't want to hear the truth, and I think that's a very perceptive comment. You saw what happened with Stéphane Dion and his carbon tax, his green shift. He just got clobbered, despite the fact that people wanted good stuff on the environment. He got clobbered by the NDP, among other parties, Jack Layton, to the point where Lynn MacDonald, the former environment critic for the federal NDP, federal or provincial, I can't remember, federal I guess, dissociated herself from her party on its environmental policy. So there's all kinds of perils. We like to talk
That's a
the
partisan
talk.
shot.
Correct. We like to talk the talk about a substance over politics, but it is a very perilous road to walk. Now, I've been very delinquent. I apologize. We've yacked too much, or maybe they have and I have too. Questions, please. And before you ask your question, so that I can head Cheri off at the pass, I'm just going to raise one more editorial comment, which I'm allowed to offer here. And that is, I'm thinking about John speaking at that Civic Action Summit that he chaired in Toronto last month, or 2 months ago, where he talked about the HST. And again, disavowed the current PC line, which is to attack the HST. And he said, I actually think it's the right tax, more or less. I think I'm paraphrasing crudely. It's an efficient tax. It's the right thing to do. The federal Tories are the ones who authored it, and yet the provincial Tories are hammering the Liberal Party on that issue. I don't want to sound like a Liberal apologist, but guess who else is hammering?
Go ahead, Martin. It's good. It's good.
Okay, I'll keep going. Look at, and Cheri can see this coming now. On the HST, the NDP is also hammering the government every day on the HST. So bringing in tough policies like the HST does invite some blowback. And even though there are some splits in the union movement, where you have Ken Luenza and you have the auto workers, you have Sid Ryan, who are opposed to the NDP line on the HST because they don't want the NDP to be a party of tax fighters. Now, why is the NDP pushing the anti-HST line, like Tim Hudak? Well, I guess they feel it will sell with voters. Okay, we're out of time. All right.
Can I speak?
15 seconds, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. Why? Because it's the hugest shift from corporations to the middle class in terms of tax. It's a flat tax. Flat tax hurts the marginalized and the oppressed the most because it's the same for everybody. What is progressive taxation. In this last budget, we now have the lowest corporate tax rates in North America in Ontario. And guess where that money is coming from? It's coming out of the school system, out of the health care. It's coming out of all of that. And how do we recoup some of that? We bring in a flat tax that hits everybody the same. I can tell you, I've got people in my riding who cannot pay their utility bills because they're paying that much more for everything else. Now, utilities is another issue as well. We have called only for the HST to be taken off utilities that affect everybody. And flat taxation is never anything I think that Social Democrat or a socialist for that matter would ever support. Now, having said that, I know that they brought it in Northern European countries, and still they have a far more progressive tax structure in Northern European countries than we do here. We have a rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, middle class emptying out. That's our Canadian reality. If you want it, that's what you got from the Liberals and Tories. If you don't want it, you got to look at other ways of taxation.
Excellent points. Okay, so
Hang on, I would not concede that's an excellent point. But anyway, we can debate taxation. It's not a flat tax, it's a consumption tax.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for pointing out. Is this on?
Oh, do we have a mic on there?
Thanks for pointing out the problems. Spent lots of time on that. Just to get to the solutions now. The problems are exactly the same as what I have in the classroom. If I ask a student to go research the platform of a party, they can't do it. And then if I go to do it and scaffold it for them and help them, I find I can't do it either because all the platforms sound the same, except for maybe a few exceptions. But so what I'm wondering about is how can we get, for the purpose of student vote, how can we get to the bottom of this so that we can differentiate these parties for the kids so that they can make an informed decision and so that they can become engaged. And so one of the ideas we're throwing around over at that table is that instead of looking at the platforms, actually maybe even make a rule that you're not allowed to look at platforms and say, look at the Hansard and look at how people vote, both in a partisan vote or a nonpartisan vote. And I also feel like maybe student vote could lead the way and actually be a leading edge on this. I want to get your opinion on maybe other people's opinion too, on what you think of that idea. And it's called cutting the BS, right? It's
Well,
like,
one quick thought to set the table here is one thing we can and should do, and the media should do more of, is to look back and collate the speeches that the leaders give. A lot of their speeches actually tip their hand ahead of the platform, which is often just a compilation of what they've said. John?
See, I don't know how you change this or regulate it, but I think all three of us will probably agree that among the best meetings you'd ever go to when you were running, especially locally, would be meetings in schools. Because younger people don't have this hesitation, they haven't developed this kind of fear of getting up and asking questions that are just on their mind, as opposed to a lot of kind of older people who think, oh, well, I probably shouldn't ask that because it's, sort of might suggest controversy or some such thing. I tend to think that I thought the best moment in the debate the other night, but it went away very quickly, was when Steve Paikin actually did intervene and said, well, I hate to do this, but you all talked about healthcare and given these platitudes that were all the same about the 6% funding increase, but could you perhaps just spend a moment explaining how you're going to pay for it? And then they all gave a non-answer to that, and it moved on. But I think we need to have more of these debates where the moderator or somebody does, or the public takes more of a role, actually saying, well, okay, that's all very nice that you've all said you're all in favor of whatever it is, because everybody always is if it's good, and they're against it if it's bad. But could we just probe that a little bit and actually start to flesh out, some of the differences, or to trip people up who are kind of mouthing platitudes? And I think similarly, and I don't know how you regulate this. I mean, I think more debates would be good, more than one. And I think that having more exposure on the part of leaders, of course, what do leaders avoid doing in campaigns? They would never go in. A leader would rarely, unless they were ahead 25 points. And even then, nowadays, they'd say, boy, that's exactly the time you wouldn't go into a high school audience and put yourself on the podium and just say, I'll take any questions you got, because the chances of some controversial question or some bad answer being given are too high. But that also takes all the kind of real accountability out of it. And I think students could play a huge role because they are curious and because they're inclined to sort of speak their mind and ask a question that's on their mind and so on, to reigniting interest and to maybe fleshing out some of those differences and forcing people to answer some questions.
But what
Can
I'm
I-
asking,
oh,
well,
sorry,
what
can
I'm
I-
asking you guys though is there a way to do it? Is there a way to get to the bottom of it, either through looking at the Hansard or looking somewhere, and the news
Your
can't
kids
do
will all
it,
quit
obviously,
school
for
if you
stated
make them
reasons.
read Hansard, trust me. Just read it when you have trouble sleeping at night. That's the only time. Can I come back on this? And this is a serious point. I don't think there are that many politicians of any party with real guts today, because if you do, you get squashed. And I'm talking about the really serious issues. Financial issues, global competitive issues, unfunded liability issues. Let me tell you something. If somebody came into you guys and said, you know what, I just give you a hypothetical. Your pension fund is underfunded, and we're both going to have to contribute more, because if we don't, we're going to make future teachers pay for your pensions. We're going to have to raise your contributions 10%, which is a tax. If we did, let me just say, if somebody did, how many people would be happy to hear that? It's so much easier, and I don't mean to single out teachers, I mean anybody. We've got unfunded liabilities everywhere around here, which is in my business called an intergenerational transfer of wealth. We are going to be asking our children, the kids you teach, to pay for our consumption. My generation does it, your generation does it. And it's just like the environmental issues, which is an intergenerational transfer of wealth. We use more than a disproportionate share of our resources, and our kids are going to have to pay for it. And most of us can't face up to, and I'm not being personal or specific, most of us can't get our head around the idea that we've got to sacrifice a little bit more for somebody else, which is the next generation.
Hear, hear.
Those are tough issues. And I honestly have the belief, deep down morally, beyond partisanship, it's so bloody easy to go out and promise anything that anybody wants to hear. No more taxes, no more taxes, no more this, no more that, whatever you want. But we have to put our mind to the big issues of each paying our way and each leaving a little bit more on the earth than we got coming in. Other than that, we are going to severely handicap the next generation.
Hear, hear.
I just want to take a little umbrage about the hits at politicians. I'm a politician, not by trade, but by calling, I suppose. And I know lots of politicians who have guts. I know lots of, I think attacking politicians is a really easy thing to do. But we are, like you are, public servants. We put ourselves out. John did, I did, David did. And we put ourselves out into a 12-hour-a-day job that goes on 7 days a week. And the higher you get, the more your target. Worst job ever as prime ministers, in terms of work hours and in terms of taking shots. And we, like you, stand in front of people every day and be who we are. And I say what I think, and I don't pull punches, and I don't pull what I'm about to say. I say what I think, just like I did from the pulpit, just like I've always done in life. So I think there is a role for that in politics, and I think lots of politicians do that. We are simply talking about the meta picture here and how that needs to be reformed. And also, I think Hansard is interesting. I do. And I think kids, if they actually watch, they came down to question period. Kids love question period. Are you kidding? They love it because it's the cut and thrust. And they think it's hilarious seeing grown-ups act so badly. They love it. And you can see how people vote. You can read what they say. This is called education. That's what you do. And you're absolutely right. Ignore the platform. Look at what they actually did when they were in government, when they were in opposition. That tells you a lot.
And you can get Hansard online. It's all online. There are a couple, it's not very well promoted, but there are a couple of URLs which will take you. You can search all the way back to roughly 1981 when David Peterson was an unknown. So there you are. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Calvin Art from St. Catharines. Thank you all for being here. Just wondering, recently OECTA announced an additional $60 levy on its members to fight the Tim Hudak campaign without them having even released their election platform yet. So, and we know from internal polling amongst members of teachers' unions that teachers tend to vote similar to the general public. So there's potential for the Conservative vote to grow even amongst teachers. So, Mr. Tory, I'm just wondering, what does Mr. Hudak need to do to win the teacher vote? And secondly, do you agree with OECTA's decision to charge this levy onto its members?
Well, I spoke about it on the radio, and I said that, you know, I guess what I was comforted by, it's not my business, but I was comforted by the fact that there was a convention, and people can say, oh, well, the convention is just delegates and it doesn't really represent rank and file teachers. Well, we have delegated conventions to do a lot of things, including representing people, having people represented in Parliament, in the legislature. So there was a convention, there was a vote taken. I assume the vote wasn't rigged, and 67% said yes. So to me, I just said, well, if that's what they said, then that's their business. It's their money, and those are the delegates that represented the teachers. With respect to what I think Mr. Hudak has to do, I mean, you know, it's not something I generally do much to offer advice to my successor, because, I mean, one might say, first of all, based on my track record, why would anybody listen to it? But also, you know, he's got his job to do. I guess if I was, what I tried to do, and again, I talked a little earlier about perhaps a mistake I made in political judgment. I'm not really sure what it was, but I tried to sort of have a progressive conservative platform on education that was sensitive to the fact that it's not about a war between teachers and school boards and governments and various other people. It should never be about that. It should actually be about the kids and making sure that they get the best education, that we find a way to resolve what David Peterson was just talking about, which is to pay for it without mortgaging the next generation to the hilt, that we treat teachers with respect as professionals, which I believe they are, and I think sometimes teachers more perhaps represented by their union heads have sort of been made to look sometimes like they're not a profession anymore, and I think that, but those were all the kinds of things that were in my head about how you can, you know, make it about the kids and produce a better education quality for kids. And I think that, I hope when Tim's platform emerges that that's what it will be. It'll be about that. And I hope he might reconsider his position, frankly, on all-day kindergarten, because I think of all the investments that we could make and all the different things you could talk about, that even you could go and borrow money to do. You know, that is one that will pay huge dividends for these people, for these kids, for families, and for the province in the end when well, I'll be gone. But the dividends will be just showing up at that point in time. So I hope that's the kind of platform they bring forward. I guess we'll see when it comes.
And if any of the others would like to comment, they're
I'm just going to interject because I think it's a really good question. I think you got a terrific answer from John Tory there. I'm a bit at in the hands of this assembly because it's 5 after 2. John made me promise that he would be liberated by about 2 o'clock so that he could go on the air.
I'll make it 2:12, and I'll make less sense than normal, but that wasn't a high standard anyway. So
2:12, and then Taylor, if he's here, may want to intervene at some point as well. Otherwise, I'm happy to stay. Did you others want to comment on that? One more question. Okay, there you have it.
Sorry. Cheri, do you want to comment?
Sorry, I've got a cough and cold today. I would say, yes, like John, it's a delegated conference. They voted to do this. It's their democratic right to say and do and put their money where they want. Having said that, I would sort of caution any union, any group, with throwing their eggs, so to speak, in one basket. I always tell lobbyists when they come, make sure you talk to everybody. If the polls stay the way they are right now, and it's a minority Tory government, let's say, and you find yourself negotiating with a Conservative government, you know, that might be the reality you find yourself negotiating with. It might be a Liberal one, it might be an NDP. Who knows what will happen in 6 months, right? So I would say speak to everybody. This is where I think negotiation and keeping your options open is always a good thing if you're lobbying for anything, because at the end of the day, you want what's best for your students. And I think that all parties say at least that they do. So hold them, all parties, to that word. That would be my only cautionary note.
Let me just take off my hat to you guys for a minute. I honestly believe, and I've said this many times, I'm the Chancellor at the University of Toronto, and I attend 35 convocations a year, and I watch all these wonderful young people coming into the world and taking a place. I honestly believe that teaching is the highest calling, and I include, by the way, the church and politics in that. You guys don't make a lot of money compared to the effort you put in, the heartache, and I know as being a dad, if my kids have the right teacher that year, my life is perfect, and you can watch the kids grow, and you can watch them flower. And I can tell you, if the reverse is the case, it's also true. But you can have such a difference in so many people's lives, and most of us had some teacher or several teachers who have made a profound transformational influence in our own lives. So you guys, it's a wonderful, wonderful place to be, and so you have to be treated with the respect that in society that you deserve. I honestly believe the single most important thing for a government to get right is education. I hate to say it's more important than health care. It's more important than jets. It's more important than everything, because there's so much depends on an educated population, whether it's health outcomes or anything else. And there's so much being dumped on you guys today to deal with kids, you know, and a whole variety of problems in society. So that leads me to your question. I think the union made a mistake. As much as I think Dalton's I don't want to be partisan, but I think he understands education better than anybody, with perhaps the exception of Bill Davis, that I have ever seen in public life. And I take off my hat to him. He's dedicated to this, and he's working very, very hard to make it. And he doesn't want a war with you guys. You cannot deliver good education if the unions are at war with the government. You cannot do it. Everybody's got to be in the same space, and you've got to build and support each other and assert the primacy of the values of higher education. I wouldn't, if I was running the union, I wouldn't, and even though presumably it helps my friend Dalton, I would say don't put yourself in the middle of that fight, either as an enemy or a friend. I think you should all be politically engaged any way you want to be. Get your kids politically engaged, and you should knock on doors wherever you like in your own riding, and teachers do have influence, but I think it's more important to do it on an individual rather than at a union basis, because the union is going to have to deal with whatever the government of the day is. And you don't want to set yourself up, no disrespect to my friend Mike Harris, as to be the enemy and get beaten because he takes down the teachers, and then you think that he's got a license to take you guys down for the next 4 years. Don't put yourself in that position. So I don't think it's a good strategy. That's my opinion, but not everybody would agree with me.
The good news is that you got 3 really interesting answers to a very good question. The bad news is that we're out of time. I've gotten my hand signal, and we're into overtime, and you know, News Talk 1010 might have to have dead air if we don't let John go soon.
Might be an improvement.
I want to thank all 3 of these politicians and retired politicians for having a great sense of humor today, self-deprecating and just plain funny, and being very civilized and being a great example to everybody else, and to giving some, I can tell you because I've listened to these guys off and on, and Cheri a little bit, and they've given some you've got really good value today. You got some very candid answers, straight from the heart and straight goods. So I want to thank you very much. I want to also just end with one thought, which is I think I've learned and you've learned that it's not as easy as it looks. And while we all call for more substance and more grown-up behavior and more dignified behavior and so on, you've now gained some insights into why parties and politicians behave the way they do in terms of strategy, the ups and downs of platforms, and as John, I think, said, and he has the scars to show it, sometimes the truth hurts. So thank you for that, and I wanted to say on behalf of everyone here, thank you for the work you're doing. We're all here because we really believe in what you're doing, and I wish we had more time for more of your questions, but good luck with Mission Impossible.